Welcome and a very good afternoon to you for this afternoon's session on high potential international offshore wind markets to 2030. My name is Jaya Calder from Highlands and Islands Enterprise, and I'm going to be running the webinar for you this afternoon. But before we start, just want to cover a couple of things. We are recording the session this afternoon. We will be sharing the slide deck as a PDF after the webinar session, and we actively involve and look for your engagement towards a Q&A at the end of the session. So as an audience, although you're automatically muted, we really encourage you to put your questions throughout the whole session until we come to a Q&A at the end. You'll see a question box, just pop it in and we will pick up all the questions and get those over to the speakers. So let's make a start, and let me introduce you to my colleague Gillian to do the introductions. Gillian.
Hi, thank you, Jaya. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining our webinar today. I am Gillian Morrison from Highlands and Islands Enterprise, and I will be helping Jaya with facilitation of this webinar, primarily in the background operating the slides. I sit alongside my colleague Ian MacDonald from Scottish Enterprise on the Supply Chain and Clusters Work Group of SOEC, which is the Scottish Offshore Wind Energy Council, and we assist Stephen Thompson in his role on SOEC and support the progress of the roadmap and actions of the group, as well as contributing to the wider SOEC objectives. At the outset, I would highlight that the slides, of which there are many, will be available on the Offshore Wind Scotland website shortly after the webinar. Over the past 6 months, SOEC have commissioned a variety of pieces of work, and this webinar is focused on one particular element, the export opportunity for offshore wind for Scotland. This commission has been supported by SOEC, which Crown Estate Scotland has provided the funding for. Our thanks and acknowledgement therefore go to Crown Estate Scotland and SOEC for enabling this work. The agenda for the day is on your screen, and as Jaya said at the outset, please do use the chat function as we go through the agenda to ensure we get a good question and answer session at the end. That is really all I wanted to highlight at the outset, and we have a lot to cover over the next 90 minutes, so I will now pass over to Stephen Thompson to give a wider overview of the SOEC supply chain and cluster activity over recent months. Thank you. Stephen.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for joining this afternoon's webinar, which I hope you will find extremely interesting. Paul Wheelhouse, the Scottish Government's former Energy Minister, helped set up SOEC 2 years ago to promote the offshore wind industry in Scotland. Last week, he wasn't re-elected to the Scottish Government, so I'd like to pay tribute to the work that he did as a minister, and there are more on that from Claire Mack, the CEO of Scottish Renewables, in the press today. The SOEC remit is split into the following 5 work streams. There's a developers group, supply chain and clusters group, skills and training, barriers to growth and innovation. And we're very much concentrating today on the supply chain and clusters group that commissioned work with BVG several months ago. They were selected as our consultants to deliver on the following, and that was to produce an offshore wind stakeholder map to identify and map the organizations involved in the supply chain for offshore wind and helping businesses to know who to engage with. This hopefully will simplify the whole landscape, and we hope to have an interactive website developed in the near future. On procurement streamlining, SOEC are now developing roadmaps to take this work a lot further, and we aim for the simplification and for increasing visibility of the pre-qualification of suppliers for offshore wind projects, advertising of tenders, and we hope to develop a supply chain charter and possible standardization of general terms and conditions. Just on the pre-qualification, it's probably worth noting that many of you have already produced reams and reams and volumes of paper to pre-qualify for separate projects or certain developers or tier ones. And it would be really useful if we were able to have a one-off hit when it comes to qualification, so that if we qualify against certain criteria, then hopefully that would do us for a year or so until we need to update. All of these initiatives, if they're successful and if we can deliver them as SOEC, they will lead to opportunities for cost reduction without a doubt. The BVGA work also looked at Scottish contents baseline. We had a UK baseline for local contents, but we didn't have a defined Scottish baseline. We now have that, and we have an alignment now of the intent to increase local content in Scotland within the wider UK intent. And this will enable us to track over time the development of Scottish content for offshore wind. It will give far more visibility to the current performance and the future performance of our supply chain. And together with the pending publication of the Scottish Investment Assessment, we will identify opportunities to increase the ability of the Scottish supply chain to compete with established overseas suppliers and contractors. The SIA will report at the end of this month, and that work was commissioned by SOWIC. The Supply Chain and Clusters Group in SOWIC also commissioned the export study that you're going to hear about today. And this has been delivered by Scotia Supply Chain. And Alan Duncan will be well known to many of you, but for those that don't know, he's a champion of the Scottish supply chain and has already notable achievements. Back in 2017, which seems a lifetime ago now, he set up the NNG, or Knight Naguia Offshore Wind Farm Coalition, to help put the case for the local supply chain as part of the evidence for the judicial review. He's very outspoken about Scottish supply chain growth and Scottish and UK local contents, and very, very passionate about that, and I'm sure you'll hear some of that passion come through in his presentation this afternoon. So I'm very pleased now to hand over to Alan Duncan, and I hope you enjoy his presentation. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Okay, warm greetings from the Kingdom of Fife. And I had a look through the attendees before I came here, so a lot of friends I know out there, supply chain. Hope you're all keeping well, but also heartened to see a lot of developer interest, overseas interest. So again, welcome to our little party today. So I think everyone was referring, when they say we've got a lot of slides, they're really referring to me. So I think there's a bit of a health warning to come up over the next 40 minutes. You know, what you're about to see, there's a lot of information here, too much for slides. But again, it's really basically where we are with the lockdown, etc. I really wanted to give as much detail to people as possible. So please don't worry, as was said, they'll be available after. So again, sit back, enjoy, don't bother taking notes. And as I say, that'll be available for you. So literally, I'm just going to have I'm not going to dally. Those who know me well know that I can be a bit of a yes, talk a lot of nonsense, but really a lot to get on with, so I will do absolutely that. So as you can see, the agenda today, credentials and contributors. Stephen's obviously talked a little bit about myself, so I'll not do that. But to give you a bit of confidence in doing this work, I have spoken to numerous people round about the SDI team, DIT team round the world, really. So again, in terms of contributors, you know, I have sort of gone far and wide and spoken to a number of people around the globe on this, so hopefully it is quite a fulsome appreciation. We're then going to talk about offshore wind export aspirations and commitments to 2030. So I just want to set the scene a little bit. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but just really OWIC and SOWIC you hear about. Again, just remind some of the people that are obviously experienced in wind. There are people new to wind on here, so again, some of this stuff might be a little bit basic. So again, I've just tried to cover newbies and experienced people, so please bear with me. So a little bit of explanation there. The international context I'll run through, the offshore wind revolution, understanding prevalent offshore wind dynamics. So again, it's a little bit consultancy, a little bit boring, but again, I just want to set the scene and it'll make sense as we go through the slides. I've had a go at some perceived high potential Scottish export sub-elements. Always creates a bit of controversy. But again, I really tried to look at logic, logistics and longevity. Again, we'll touch on what I'm calling NATI title, the International Offshore Wind Market Attractiveness Index. So again, really try to look at scale, stage, and couldn't come up with another S, so Scottishness. You know, how open are these markets to Scottish supply? The bit in bold there we'll go through the most is obviously the high potential market deep dive, top 10+1, and just some positioning stuff and closing statements. So on with we go. So strap yourself in. This will be a 40-minute, 35-minute ride through the world now. Okay, so just taking a little bit of a step back, you know, aspirations and commitments. I don't really want to cover this extensively, but, you know, most of you will be aware that are involved in wind. You know, we have a UK target, 2030 target set at an OWIC level, you know, and some of the things, you know, the sector deal's been transformational. You know, the 30 gigawatt by 2030 has now been superseded last year. You know, we will be targeting 40 gigawatts. It still probably puts UK at the second market globally, and as a Celtic fan, I know what it's like to be a deposed regime, but China will overtake the UK this year. But again, still lots to be excited about from a UK perspective. Round 4 has been concluded down south for those that have missed it, so 8 gigawatts of new leases down south. Again, I think front-end fee maximisation focus, and we'll come back to ScotWind as we go through this. 60% local content, most of you will be aware of this. Again, the comment I've got on that is obviously, international markets are likely to adopt a similar position through time. So again, we've got to be conscious and respectful of that. I think 1 gigawatts of floating has been very significant. So I think we've now got a kind of 1 gigawatt target at a UK level for 2030, and again, I think the Irish Sea development and focus in there, that gives another string to the UK's bow, if you like, as well as the Scottish aspirations to be first movers in this space. So really, the big thing I want to focus on that most people don't really notice when they look at the sector deal is it's really about a 5-fold increase of exports by 2030. So it's only 8 years away, really. So 2.6 billion per year. That's essentially what the industry has signed up on. So really, I've tried to keep that focus as I've looked in here as well. If we are going to target 2.6 billion, where, how, and where are the highest probabilities? The bottom there, again, I'm not going to go through. You can have a look at them when you see the slide pack. But again, SOWEC goals are very distinct, very different from OWIC at the moment. Kind of target of 8 gigawatts for 2030. Pretty sure that'll be increased. And again, just to the right there, that's just the table specifically on export markets. So just to really show that export markets is a key part of what SOWEC's looking to do. So just take a little bit step back, just a little bit of context, and where you see in green, it's just I'm going to fly through some of these, but as I say, hopefully this works for everybody, that there's a much wider and fuller slide pack on its way to you. But really the context, the need to rapidly decarbonise the global energy mix is stark. The UK offshore wind journey, quite honestly, has been an incredible success story of our time. And I think it's quite fitting that, the eyes of the world will be on Scotland for COP26 later on this year. So again, I think hopefully this is kind of step one in us kind of laying down our marker as we look internationally. Second point, green tax villains to largest energy mix enablers in 5 years. Green is the new black, as it were. I've been involved in offshore wind for about 10 years, looking at strike prices of 150 pounds per megawatt, thinking this is never going to fly. But it's been an incredible success story, and really, as I've said there, the window of opportunity is there for the Scottish supply chain. You've been part of the biggest market in the world, and there are important lessons learned that can be applied internationally. I think the other thing contextually to think about is no one size fits all by geography or sub-element. So whilst I'm giving you today is not chapter and verse, it's really just an opinion. It's there to be challenged. But again, it's really just to look at the fundamentals of each market that you want to look at. There's a logistical consideration, a socio-economic, contracting, cultural. These all need to be looked at a granular level. There is no one size fits all, and it doesn't really matter whether it's capex or opex. Floating wind, again, I feel Scotland's a nation that has always punched above its weight in innovation and international trading terms. And absolutely, I think floating wind we see as possibly our niche. But again, there's a number of international markets will go straight to floating. Some will go like the UK through time. But really, my point is, if we do have aspirations to be the centre of excellence, time is of the essence. Competition is fierce. So the 11 markets I'll go through today, again, just that table there you can see, just to kind of frame the size of the prize. By 2030, the 11 markets I've got here will have about 150 to 160 gigawatts in place versus the UK's 40. So it's really a kind of 4 times the size, if you like, on these 11 markets. And again, you can see in the last column the opportunity. So whereas in the UK this decade we're looking at a kind of 30 gigawatt prize, these markets represent 3 times that size. So again, it is sometimes difficult to get mired in the UK sector. There is absolutely a huge marketplace out there. So I think the first thing, is to identify international considerations and leverage Scottish relationships. So again, the feeling for me, ScotWind, as I talked about previously, there's a massive amount of international interest in Scotland at the moment. So really the message is to leverage these export opportunities via these multinational entities and their main contractors, which again are on the call and very active in Scotland. So really, it's about understanding deployment and specific requirements, which is really what I'm about to do now. Looking at the contracting arrangements, what they're likely to be, technology choices, some logistical challenges by market, supply threats, because again, we've really got to look at that from a Scottish point of view is what we're up against, and again, base that on known Scottish offshore wind competencies. So that's really just a little bit of context. So again, this is, I apologise, it's a little bit consultancy and a little bit boring, but it's just to give a little bit of contextual flavour. So really what I've done here, to kind of the wider report that I've done, I've really sort of mapped out, if you like, a mid-20s standard Scottish-esque project 500 megawatts, operating for 35 years. So I've just kind of tried, and you can see on the right there, just kind of looked at, what likely £2.75 billion spend. That's a kind of standard-ish product. But again, the thing is, different stages of technology life cycle in different markets. No two wind farms are the same. But I think the good thing is, a lot of markets are behind Scotland in this technology. So what I've mapped out here is probably representative of a standard offshore wind farm. So just to look at some of the dynamics. So if you look at the DevEx phase there, again, I've sort of based that on a kind of a 6-year phase. In the UK, there's no site pre-development generally. But generally what you've seen there as a context is the DevEx phase is probably earlier wind farms are about 10 years. They've probably halved. But again, if there are a lot of DevEx phase opportunities out there, but be conscious of the international nuances by each market. I've noted some of them there. You may be challenged on specific local market type information, site-specific conditions. So again, it's just to be aware of that. Again, as I mentioned there, a lot of international markets pre-develop sites. So I guess what I mean by that is the state, if you like, do a lot of the kind of site characterisation. So I guess what that means is, A, there's opportunities for work with these state agencies, and secondly, the DevEx cycle can be a little bit shorter in markets like that. For example, Netherlands, which we'll come on to in a minute, they're pretty much looking to have an auction and then have deployment 3 years after that. So, depending on which market, the DevEx cycles can be longer or shorter. To that point, it could be heavily influenced about how advanced offshore wind or the seabed licensing process is. So again, just be aware of that. And again, just really for DevEx, innovation is going to come into this area. The changing nature of early development activities, there's going to be a lot of kind of non-fixed data acquisition solutions, high-def surveying, etc. But again, I think, DevEx phase Scotland has a lot of good capabilities that can, are applicable internationally. So again, just a little bit of understanding. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but again, just as we step through the standard offshore wind life cycle, for my assumption in here, I've kind of assumed an EPCI contracting strategy. Now, I'm not going to go through here. I've put a description in there. But essentially, I've kind of, and I know this is where the tier ones and developers are pulling their hair out looking at this. It's not as simple as just either or, various models. But for the purposes of this analysis, we've just kind of looked at, which developers' countries are likely to maybe prefer an EPC model versus multi-contracting. The significance of which, I guess, from an EPCI point of view, my advice there, Scottish exporters are most likely to enter the market via a pre-existing relationship with a tier one. So if you're involved with a Van Oord or a GSC in terms of their spread, it doesn't necessarily need a direct approach to that market. So from an EPCI point of view, I guess what I'm saying is you can be taken to that market without physically being there. Multi-contracting, generally dealing directly with the developer, which can probably happen in country or via sort of centralised procurement functions. But again, I know it's not as simple as that, but for the purposes of this, we've just split it into the two types. On to CapEx, foundations, again, in my assumptions, I've assumed jackets here. But again, there's a lot of proliferation out there. What I will say, foundation choice is generally pretty well known to 2025. But beyond that, for the purposes of this, I've made a number of broad assumptions. It's not all about water depth, but I have just used it in this case. So generally, any market, kind of 0 to 40 metres, I'm assuming monopiles, 40 to 65, generally jacket sweet spot, and above that is floating. But again, very, very simplified, but just for the purposes of this analysis. So again, just stepping through the supply chain again onto sort of cable supply. So again, in my case, I've assumed a pretty standard setup of a Scottish-esque project. In terms of cables, I think innovation in cable technology is coming. Projects are going further from shore. That will particularly influence export cables, for example, things like loss. But again, cables is what you'll see with a lot of these markets. It's generally becoming quite a heavily commoditized item. Some very, very strong OEMs and tier ones out there. And what you'll see is they're essentially going out to these markets. So essentially, if you've made the connection in the UK, there's a very good chance you can then sort of carry that connection forward. Substations, talk about there. Again, international markets very, very different than makeup than the UK. Generally, a lot of countries have kind of offshore capacity already in place. So maybe not as much kind of offshore substation type opportunity. But again, that's assumptions I've made here. Turbines, turbines, really cool area, as most of you be aware. But again, the point is, I think, I've assumed 8 megawatt turbines here. Again, you can see by that graphic there, there's a whole technology race coming in. And I think it's, the point to make really is international market selections are pretty much, again, known to 2025. But again, by applying this kind of rough generation evolution, if you like, we can kind of map where countries are likely to be by 2030. So that's what I've done in this analysis. One point just to note on this before we flip on, a lot of these new market entry countries, because, things like monopile foundations, it's very much a proven technology, etc. So some of the early countries may try and extend existing turbine capacities, if smaller, rather than moving to a bigger turbine that basically is already proven on a monopile. So it's just something to remember, as some early markets might not be as quick on the kind of heavy technology side as maybe the UK, Germany, Netherlands, etc. They're likely to be the first to really go with the big turbines. And lastly, of the kind of boring consultancy bit, again, just a little bit of context. Installation. So for the purposes of this, I've assumed sort of 6 discrete installation contracts. The reality is very, very different. You'll see as you go out there, sometimes it's kind of designer led, sometimes it's OEM led, sometimes vessel led. So again, for the purposes of this, I've assumed that is split off, but very often that can be packaged together. Last 2 areas, OPEX. Again, I've made an assumption there of a 35-year operation. Again, a lot of these new wind farms are being designed for 40-year operation. And again, just to be mindful, if you're in that space, again, as they go further from shore, etc., there's going to be a huge demand for remote interventionless solutions, large separate, move to SOV vessels, etc. So again, a real sort of changing mix. And lastly, decommissioning. I haven't really talked about that much. It is something that we generally sort of gloss over, but generally, it is a market that Scotland will be set up and good for, but it's unlikely to reach critical mass till the next decade. So again, I haven't really focused on it too much. So the classic consultancy bit. Bottom right there, lovely consultant slide of limited use, I grant you, but essentially that's basically the mapped wind farm, generally how the money goes, where. So really this slide's just a bit of a ready reckoner as you're considering markets. It's just to think about where a market maybe is or a project is on that life cycle up to the top left there, and generally that's what the spend profile looks to the right. But again, not much use on this call, but very consultancy and looks great. So we now get into, and as again, I'll draw everyone's attention to one of the things I said at the start there. This is, you put yourself out there doing pieces of work like this, and the one thing you do get is a lot of feedback saying you're wrong. So listen, I've had a go here. BVG, as Stephen talked about, have been very successful in this kind of area historically. But really what I've done here is just sort of look through the supply chain based on that model and just sort of looked at, kind of 3 criteria. Does Scotland have inherent capability in this area? Does Scotland have track record in offshore wind in this area? And what is export suitability? So again, I'm not going to go through that in detail. In the main report, there is a lot of sort of text round about it, about why I've maybe made these characterizations. But again, it's up for debate. It is something that we as a nation will need to hone a little bit further. But I think some of the green areas there is where I feel Scotland has a very good chance internationally, has something to sell, and maybe some of the ambers are where we need to focus. Stephen talked about some of the work at the SIA there, so it's about backing winners and going after stuff. So again, happy to debate this with people, but again, it's just a little bit of a view of where I think we may or may not be strong, and where we may struggle, if you like. I'm on to International Offshore Wind Attractiveness Index. I'll need to come up with a better title than that. Essentially, what I've tried to do here, really just look through, which I have for the last 6 months, is I've touched, I think, every offshore wind project that's registered in the RUK database as of the 1st of January of this year. So yeah, just a real trawl through every market, and really just, this is my feeling, if you like, on kind of how to grade it, if you like, from a heat map point of view. So I think there's really 5 criteria I've considered as I've gone through this. Market scale for me, and I think that's maybe a 50% contributor, again, up for debate, but for me, I think size is everything. So again, you can see the gradings I've given to markets there based on size. And as I say, most international markets now have a stated 2030 deployment aspiration. So we can pretty effectively make a good assessment of what the size of the market's likely to be. So I think, I've graded it in terms of size in the first box. Moving along, appetite for importing expertise. So again, I think, touching on what I started at the start, some countries have an appetite for importing, some don't. So again, it's just a little bit of a perception view on what is the appetite for expertise. So in general, if it's perceived that a country has a strong domestic supply chain, it would obviously be possibly red or amber. But again, there's a lot of things you need to consider here in terms of, the relative supply chain strength, gaps in expertise, price competitiveness, political pressure, etc. So again, but just having a bit of a heat map there. The next criteria is really early stage supply chain development. So again, it's almost this idea of, the earlier the market supply chain development, the better for us Scots, as it were. So that's really what that criteria is. But again, it's just looking at where the market is, the level of local supply chain development, and where Scottish supporters may be able to, exert maybe a bit more influence based on lessons learned or what we've learned in the UK. The fourth criteria really sort of looking at sort of cultural and logistical barriers. Again, language, culture, geographical proximity, particularly matters if you're looking at capex supply. But again, in theory, markets closer to Scotland theoretically would score higher on that. But again, it's not quite as simple as just that. And the last criteria is political support, mixed change, urgency. So again, I think assess the market to kind of think, what is the urgency for that market to move? How much political support is there? Are any aspirations put out there for 2030 likely to be realised or not? So again, just a bit of an assessment. Again, it brings in things like, Nordics countries, for example, have absolute fantastic capability to deploy offshore wind, but have an abundance of clean hydropower, etc. So the need is not so much for them to move. So again, there's a little bit of an assessment there as we consider each market. So let's dive in. So onto Europe. So you can see two graphs there. Really how I've split the market is kind of looking at ultra short term, if you like, now to 2025 and then 25 to 30. Because I think as you look around a lot of markets based on, as I say, a kind of 5-6 year development cycle, anything that's kind of, deployment to 2025 is kind of already fixed or getting that way. So that's why I've essentially split the market, that essentially short term will be sort of highly likely to realise, and onto the sort of 2030, which is less so. But again, most countries, as I say, have 2030 targets in place. So looking at the short term for Europe, 29 gigawatts. So these are the countries, 7 countries in Europe that have identified as high potential there. So really it's a 29 gigawatt increase across the next 5 years. Unsurprisingly, Germany and the Netherlands are the biggest, as you can see there, accounting for about 63%. But again, the Danish market is re-energising, and a couple of really interesting new entrants, France, Poland and Ireland. And again, they're bringing about 7 gigawatts in the short term. So again, we'll dive into that in a moment. And again, looking a bit further out in terms of kind of the next 5 years after that, so essentially that's a 62 gigawatts, so quite a nice, 30 gigawatts is going to double in size in the next 5 years to 62. Again, you can see the split profile is pretty similar, but, I guess the emerging nations taking a bigger share. You can see Germany, for example, was 40, now 34. So, interesting, no surprises there, but, a really, really stable growth market. So this is where the slides go a bit daft. And yeah, you're probably looking at the ones at the bottom left and going, I can't read that. But, when the stuff comes out, we'll fix it. I really just wanted to get as much in here as we can. So Germany, just diving in there. So I think 2025, the first thing I should say, the graph to the left, any project that, I've kind of gone on a green, amber, red. It's not a hard and fast rule, but generally if a project is kind of post FID, moving into construction is kind of green, amber, consented, but maybe not necessarily got its FID or CFD type thing as amber, red, development cycle. So again, just a broad kind of roadmap there. So, looking at Germany, kind of had a very, very good year last year, over a gigawatt. Germany's been a funny market, it input a lot and then had a huge splurge into 2020 with the projects as I've seen there. But as you can see, over the next 3 to 4 years, there's not a huge amount of deployment in relative terms, really until 2025 is really when you'll see a big upturn. So, there's been a target increase in Germany. I think their WindSea Act, as I've talked to last year, they're up to now a 20 gigawatts. So, it's a good, stable, it's number 2 to the UK and Europe, a good, stable market that really is going to come back a little bit. I've put the table there to the left, which hopefully you can see. But, there's 4 gigawatts of well-advanced projects nearing construction. Again, short-term focus much more on the Baltic Sea. So you'll see on these tables, I've tried to put as much information, what sea it's in, whether we know about the turbine, what's the likely foundation, distance to shore, likely to be forecast. So again, any developers out there looking at a project and going, that's not the date, again, it's just a little bit of a sense of how it feels that project may or may not go into the water. So the 4 gigawatts of projects I've said there, Ørsted, RWE, Iberdrola, about 50% of this market. So again, I'm pointing out the obvious, but these guys have a strong existing UK presence. So, we need to leverage that where we can here in Scotland. Outside of Germany, outside of the UK, Germany has one of the most advanced offshore wind supply chains globally. Apologies, you can't read that down there, but essentially what I've done there is just mapped all of the major contracts against the projects to see how's the supply chain wrapping up, with a bit of heat map to see, which suppliers are coming. So I think turbines, really what you can see there, it's a much more dispersed market than the UK. And from an installation point of view, Fred Olsen have a strong position there. Foundations really dominated heavily by monopiles. You can see there, just based on the seascape, it looks as if it's going to be a monopile market. GOC, very, very strong installer there. Substations, I've said, is a much small onshore market, as much of the capacity is connected offshore. But again, some details there. Very international supply chain feeling in Germany. Array cables, again, often contracted as an EPCI contract. You're going to see this as a recurring theme happening quite a lot. You know, the big OEMs, you know, like your Nexans, Prysmians, NSW, you know, very, very strong in that market. You know, Boskalis, Van Oord, you know, the largest installers. Yeah, and again, export cables, the same as Arrays. You know, you're seeing these big kind of EPCI tier 1 type players, you know, Jan de Nul, Van Oord, very, very strong in this market. That's the kind of short term, looking out the next 5 years. So again, kind of pulling into kind of red projects, if you like, so kind of development cycle. So again, you'll see that table there. There's about 10 gigawatts of kind of development projects. You know, really, that's the forecast there. I expect 10 gigawatts probably to go in, so probably come in about 21.4. I know that the government in Germany is targeting 20, so there might be a wee bit of attrition. But if all of that's built out, you know, that's kind of how it looks. On that table there, again, for anybody pointing out, where I've put 50% monopile, 50% jacket, doesn't mean we're going to likely to split that. It just means it could be either. It's kind of based on the water depth, either or. So just to give an indication of what the foundation is likely to be. I'm not going to focus too much on these graphs below, but basically, I guess it's maybe a bit of a teaser for the wider report. What I've then done is mapped what this looks like into these majors. So what it looks like from a DevEx point of view. So you can see the German profile DevEx. Foundations, what's the number, what they're looking like. Turbines, bottom left, you know, what's the number, what's the rating. Cables and OMS. So again, just to show you, you know, that analysis is in the wider report, but I'll not be going through that in essence of time today. So lastly, just on Germany, you know, I'm not going to go through these. I've kind of highlighted a number of I guess, challenges for the Scottish supply chain in here, some opportunities, and at the bottom left there, just really, you know, engaging with the SDI people in country, you know, some of the kind of movers and shakers out there in terms of kind of clusters, etc. But again, like Paul O'Brien with Deepwind, you know, they've got very strong links in Germany. So again, but just a little bit of info there. But I'm not going to go through this slide in the essence of time. But again, please have a look at it. You know, just some considered thoughts on potential opportunities and challenges for Scottish exporters. So on to Netherlands. You know, Netherlands is a really cool market. You know, I think I'm expecting 6.7 gigawatts in the short term. You know, a couple of green projects, a couple of red ones there. You know, so Netherlands is really starting to happen now. Borssele 1 and 2 went in last year. You know, there's much more auctions going on. So I think you can see there, you know, it's a market that really is starting to gain a bit of pace. You know, I'm not going to go through all the projects there, but again, just to highlight, you know, obviously very, very strong still on monopiles, very like German. And again, this is still a North Sea focused market. But again, you can see the kind of likely projects there. Below that, again, not really too visible, but again, you can see how the last 5 years is how the projects have gone in the last 5 years. So again, you can see some interesting trends there in terms of strengths. So as I say, turbines, very similar market to the UK, you know, SGRE, MVOW, you know, the dominant OEMs, Van Oord, GOC, again, turbines. So again, you're going to see these same names coming up because again, these companies are, you know, expected to be prevalent, you know, in all these high potential markets. Foundations, again, it's currently solely built around monopiles. So again, you've got like the SIF and Smulders, very, very strong. You know, Orsted's been an interesting, have a look at that project. That's kind of broken, you know, a very international mix they've brought to Borssele 1 and 2. Again, as I said, substations, not really too much going on there, but array cables and export cables, again, as you would expect in their home market. You know, the Netherlands has some fantastically strong and capable tier 1s installers. So again, as you would expect, they're very, very prominent in this market. Again, you know, looking forward the next 5 years, looking at about 11.4 gigawatts in the Netherlands. You know, again, you can see that a lot of that's coming from kind of tender zones, again, all in the North Sea, and again, most likely monopiles. So again, you know, a really, really interesting market that's really set to grow. Again, I'm not going to go through this the opportunities and challenges there, but I think, and again, I've put down some of the contacts there. But again, very, very tough market. I think commercially, you know, a very, very strong tier 1 presence. So, but yeah, nonetheless, a very, very high growth market. Denmark, so as I talked about, Denmark kind of started the ball rolling in offshore wind and then kind of disappeared a little bit, but are back. So as you can see there, you know, an interesting short-term profile. You know, they've got 1.7 gigawatts in the water, probably looking to double that in the next 5 years. So again, you can see the projects there, pretty well advanced. Again, all kind of highly monopile. Not been a lot of activity. So the supply chain table you can see there at the bottom is quite sparsely populated. But again, some of the supply chain trends we notice, you know, the turbine supply market, again, similar to the UK with the two dominant companies that have been in the UK so far. Foundations, Danish market is almost exclusively monopiles transition. You know, so you've got the likes of Bladt, etc. up there. Again, will be very, very strong in that market. And again, array cables, you know, similar picture that the usual suspects are doing a good job there. So again, further out, so again, Denmark, it's 10 gigawatts. I expect Denmark to challenge 10 gigawatts. You can see there, you've got a number of tenders coming up. Again, most likely monopiles. Bit of a split. There's one in the Baltics, 2 in the Baltic Sea there, 2 in the North Sea. But again, really, really interesting market and certainly back. Again, not going to go through the challenges, etc. But again, a very, very interesting market. And it has to be said, geographically pretty close to Scotland. So again, for CapEx suppliers, that is significant. France, wow, where do you start in France? France has had a roller coaster ride into wind, but I think we're finally on the starting blocks in France. So I think 3 gigawatts probably in the next 5 years. Again, relatively advanced projects. You can see I've got them there. So a real eclectic mix in there. Interesting, kind of like the UK market, some monopiles, some floating, some jacket. So, again, France, very, very interesting market. Again, not been too much supply chain built up there, but I've put in a little bit down at the bottom there. But again, in terms of kind of things to note, turbines, no surprise that, GE are likely to be very strong down there. Foundations, as I said, a real eclectic mix in there. And again, I guess pretenders to the Scottish throne of sort of centre of excellence of floating offshore wind to an extent. Substations, array cables, export cables, it's pretty similar to other markets, Prysmian, Nexans, etc. So on to the next decade after that. So I think France will continue. Again, pull in, you can see the tender zones I've got up there. So a number of floating ones, as you say. So I expect maybe about 7.4 gigawatts in there. Again, not going to go through the challenges. It's all there for you to see. I think it's fair to say, though, that it's probably, French strike prices generally are a little bit higher than in the UK and the rest of Europe. And I think, there's an expectation on that France will get a little bit more local content. So I think it's being fair and polite to say that, local content may be an issue down in France if you're targeting that market. But again, it's, I don't want to say no market is off limits and no market is unachievable. But again, just maybe thinking about refining your entry model there, maybe a partnership model down there. Because again, that's one thing always to remember is, on the back of Brexit, etc., is as much as you're looking to get into international markets, there's also a premium for getting access to the UK market, so you can often trade access. So again, this is just a one slider. I'm not really going to go through this one. I've got everything into one slide on this one, but again, it's simply because Belgium, there's not too much happening in the short term to 2025 there, and again, likely to return more towards 29-30. But again, all the details are there. But in the scheme of things, not one of the biggest markets, but probably 4 gigawatts by 2030. But worth, certainly if you're an OPEX provider, for example, they've got a very healthy established capacity. So again, if you're looking at that area of supply, good market. Poland's going to be huge. Now you see there that there's nothing there pre-25. I know there is aspirations for Poland to get, but I think basically where it is, it's likely to be a kind of 26, 27 type deployment. But not to say that, you'll see stories on the news of, Poland is really starting to motor. I think the encouraging thing in Poland, it has its mechanisms in place. It has an offshore wind act, it has a roadmap, and I think I've got a fact in there that I think the Baltic Sea is reputed to have about 93 gigawatts of offshore wind capacity. I think about a third of that is in Polish waters. So, you can see there's some massive pipeline of projects coming through. Again, likely to be monopiles, not a given, but just looking at the seascape, that's likely how it will look. Ireland. So I'm very active in Ireland, do a lot over there. Again, you can see there, they're going to have a tough job. I think if we can get something in the water by 2025, we'll be doing well. But that's certainly the aspiration, to have a gigawatt and 3.5 by 2030. So there's 7 relevant projects over there. And again, a bit of commonality with Scottish projects over there. So again, I've put in all the projects there you can see, and some of the potential challenges and opportunities. One thing I will say, Ireland, Ireland is a lot of similarities to the Scottish market. A big floating potential in the future, and I guess probably a supply chain similar to ours with some gaps. So, I always say I think there's a lot of kindred spirits between Ireland and Scotland from a kind of collaboration point of view going forward. Asia, and I realise I've got a minute left, so I've failed miserably. So, the markets I'll look at in Asia, I think the key thing to mention there is that Asia basically comes from nothing. So they're looking at less than 0.3 of a gigawatt now. So the 3 markets I'm going to look at are Taiwan, Japan, South Korea. And you can see the profile there that really by 2030, I'm expecting maybe 27 gigawatts to be challenged, which from a standing start is pretty awesome. So Taiwan, again, ridiculously run out of time. I'll not go through, but you know the format there. Everything is in there that I've kind of talked about. Green project. A lot of projects going into construction now, as you've kind of seen. If you've been living under a rock, you'll not know that. But Taiwan, things are really starting to move over there. Again, I've put the supply chain mapping down there, so check it out. And again, even busier slide. But again, just looking a bit further forward, I expect them to come in about 10 gigawatts. Up at the top right there, a lot of in-country enabling support, very good SDI office over there, etc. So again, keep an eye on these projects. And again, the thing I always say is look for an angle where there is maybe a developer or a tier one that you've got a relationship with the UK, making a play over there, because Taiwan is one of those markets. Japan, I expect basically to be as big as Taiwan, not in the short term, probably 2 gigawatt challenge, but again, a very, very interesting market that's going to move hell of a quick. And again, similar to the UK, probably, I'm going to say it sees its future is in floating wind. And again, even smaller text. But again, as I say, 10 gigawatts, I think by Japan. But again, all the stuff is in there. Some really good opportunities down there. I'm very active in Japan at the moment. But, there's a realisation that there is some gaps in the supply chain down there, and very, very keen to work with experienced Scottish suppliers. So, very interesting market. South Korea is the next one. The interesting thing, I think, for that, there's not too much going to come in pre-2025, because South Korea is one of these markets that pretty much will go straight to floating. So, again, it's almost intrinsically linked. What will be installed there will be the commercialisation of floating wind, I guess. So, again, a little bit more of a slower burner. But, again, kindred spirits from a Scottish point of view, that a huge market from a floating wind perspective. USA, I could spend 40 minutes on my own talking about the US. So listen, if I knew what the US was going to have in by 2030, I'd have the numbers picked. I think they're looking at 30 gigawatts now by 2030. It's going to be a real stretch, but again, I've put kind of the leading projects down there, the ones that I expect to probably go first. Again, I've got the kind of wider pipeline. What you can see there, some of the challenges. Again, I apologise, I've run out of time, but I don't want to be rude and leave other people. But again, a lot of good stuff. And again, SDI have some excellent in-country support for companies out there. So I haven't talked about the medium potential ones, and there will be some controversial ones in there. But again, in the essence of time, we'll maybe move on, but happy to kind of debate. I guess probably the biggest ones that is to mention is China. Obviously, people are expecting China to be in there, and probably Vietnam, because Vietnam's as big as any of the other Asian markets. I think just the perception is, culturally, it's almost building up slightly separately, the Chinese market and the Vietnamese market to a certain extent. So it's not to say there is not opportunity out there. I just think we need to look at it through a different lens. So my last points, and apologies, Susan, I've got 2 minutes to go. I'm not going to go through these, but just sort of some final rallying thoughts, I guess, on a quick rattle through the world there. As I say, I think you're going to have to be all things to all men, as it were. Adapt your approach by markets. Look at where there are gaps in markets. Look at where there is an appetite for partnering. But again, just some random thoughts from me there, and that should be me done with 3 minutes to spare. So apologies, that was a little bit condensed at the age there, but please do reach out. I'm all over this stuff, and as you can tell, as Stephen said, I'm kind of quite pumped looking at it. But please do get in touch. But listen, it's my pleasure to introduce Alistair McMillan, who will be the first to give you an overview of some of the really fantastic support and financial aid that is out there to help you on your journey. Bon voyage.
Thanks, Alan. That was great. And good afternoon, everybody. Hope you're all well and looking forward to the new freedoms that just announced at lunchtime there. Sadly, I probably can't because I live in Elgin, but hopefully it's not too far away. This is a very brief session, kind of 15 minutes, so I'm going to keep it fairly high level. I've gone for a minimalist approach to slides, as you can see. In terms of who I am, I'm the Export Development Manager for Clean Growth for UK Export Finance in Scotland. We have 24 people based around the UK that interact with businesses, with banks, with industry bodies, etc. So I interact with locally across Scotland and Northern Ireland with businesses, with industry bodies, with banks, with businesses as well. I just wanted to cover basically the who, why, what, how of UK Export Finance, say fairly high level. I'm happy to have individual conversations with businesses on the back outside of the presentation, because there's not a lot of detail in here because of time. But the short section, who is UK Export Finance? Well, essentially we're the UK government's export credit agency. We're part of the UK Treasury and very closely aligned with Department of International Trade, and obviously work very closely with SDI in Scotland. Our mission or purpose of UK Export Finance is to ensure that no viable export fails for lack of finance or insurance. There's a very key role in terms of exporting where the private sector can't support the UK businesses. The why is why is that relevant to the audience today? And probably more relevant to, I guess, the supply chain than some of the lead contractors and OEMs perhaps on the call. I will touch on that a little bit later. I focused on that element, those elements on this short presentation. So why it's relevant potentially is if you're looking to export and take advantage of some of these fantastic export opportunities in offshore wind, there's a fair chance you're going to need some contract bonds, so the likes of a performance bond, warranty bonds, advance payment guarantees as part of the contractual negotiation potentially. You may also need additional working capital, so cash flow, because with exports in general, the payment terms will be different, the delivery schedules, etc., will be different. So there could be a longer period between incurring your first costs and actually getting paid, and that creates a larger working capital requirement. And where we fit in is basically where you have those additional requirements, financing, lending, bonds and guarantees, and the private sector, your bank or insurance company, are unable or unwilling to provide the support you need. And that's where we can step in and we can help those institutions to provide the facilities you need. So what do we do? What is it we actually do? Most relevant, as I say, probably to the supply chain on the call, is we provide guarantees to the likes of your banks, all the major banks across the UK, and other financial providers, where there is an exporting contract or an exporter that needs additional banking facilities and the bank isn't able on their own to do that. We can provide a guarantee to them, which acts as security for them to provide facilities you need. In terms of what is an export, should be fairly obvious probably, particularly from Alan's speech as well, but I think from our perspective, it's fairly clear it's got to be goods, but also services, and there's got to be an overseas buyer involved. Now, I think crucial in terms of offshore wind, a couple of points I would make, is the goods or services don't have to be delivered overseas. So, talking about offshore wind developments around the UK shores, for example, the goods and services don't have to be delivered in a foreign country, but there needs to be an overseas buyer, there needs to be an overseas entity, is one point. The other crucial point is that you don't actually have to be a direct exporter to access our support, because we support exports. Where you're a UK supply chain company providing goods or services to another UK company that is exporting, we can also support you with your bank and insurance. And that's because clearly if there's an intrinsic link between the export itself and you supplying that UK exporter, cover can extend to you as well. And how do you access our support? Well, essentially, if you're accessing it, as I'm saying, as a supply chain company, typically the first approach will be to your bank or insurance company if you're looking for credit insurance, because you may need these, bonds or working capital facilities. They're the first place to go. And clearly, what a bank would need in terms of how you access our facilities, if you're looking for increased lending for working capital, for cash flow or bonds and guarantees, the bank will need your financials, your most recent published financials. They will want forecast financials, balance sheet, P&L, cash flow forecasts for at least a year, potentially the length of the project, but at least a year. And those financials forecasts should obviously show the requirement for the borrowing or the bonds and the impact of winning those opportunities and delivering those opportunities, including the lending and facilities needed from the bank. And in terms of bonds, I'm talking about, I think I mentioned, advance payment guarantees, performance bonds, warranty bonds potentially as well. And in terms of working capital, it's basically cash flow to deliver fulfilled projects. In terms of banks, you'll be aware probably the banks always like security. And for bonds, the default position for banks typically is they want cash collateral in the absence of other security. So if you already have business premises and that's secured to the bank and there's plenty of headroom in terms of the value of that property, they may not ask for cash collateral, but typically they will. And clearly that's a strain on the business because the cash is needed in the business to deliver and fulfill contracts. particularly galling when it's an advance payment guarantee and you need the cash for working capital, and the bank says, well, just put that in an inaccessible account until the loan's matured and expired, which is absolutely no good to the business. And that's where we provide guarantees instead, security to the bank. And you'll know that when we're a banking relationship, you should obviously know how much security the business has in terms of premises or guarantees or anything else already with the bank and how much you can offer. So when you're looking at going to the bank with additional facilities, clearly you need to be aware if you're asking for facilities that exceed the security available. If it does, then that's when we may be able to support and come into play. And you need to enlist the support at the bank of their international trade specialists. They're the guys that we are very familiar with. They're the guys that we talk to all the time, very familiar with our support, how it works. And they will work with your bank manager, relationship manager at the bank to bring the right package to the business for what they require with our support, or potentially without it if they can do it themselves. So it's about understanding that security aspect and where we can come in to provide our support. But you need to enlist the trade specialist. So I'm going to go over a couple of case studies to try and hopefully bring that to life. As I said, more detail I'm happy to share or have individual conversations with. So this is a couple of case studies of the kind of I've been talking about, providing bank facilities and us underwriting those bank facilities for businesses. First Tech Limited, a group based in Aberdeen, and First Subsea, one of the subsidiaries they have, which is actually based in Lancaster. This is a prime example. The company, they kind of started the transition journey effectively back in 2014 with a new strategy and some product development. They traditionally oil and gas focused. What they've evolved into is largely providing cable protection systems for offshore wind developments, and they've been quite successful. They, at the time they approached us and we were talking to the bank, they had a pipeline of about £13 million worth of cable protection system projects across various projects, developments, and various overseas buyers. They'd already kind of almost reached the security limit they had with the bank, so they needed more capacity, more ability to issue bonds, and that's when we got involved. As part of their contract negotiations, they requested and negotiated advance payment guarantees. So advance a chunky sum of cash upfront to help with the working capital or cash flow. In exchange for that, they needed to get the bank to issue advance payment guarantees. As I said, typically the bank would say, well, I'll take that cash and put it in a restricted account and you can't have it till the bond's expired, which is absolutely pointless. So we got involved. We provided a guarantee through a bond support scheme. It was actually a bond facility we provided for multiple bonds over several years, which then allowed the bank, to extend additional bond facilities to them so they could continue to fulfill the contracts that was in the pipeline and win even more contracts. So PCT Group Sales, based in Glasgow, similar scenario with them. They are traditional oil and gas engineering company. They manufacture davit cranes and other types of cranes lifting equipment, and only recently moved into offshore wind. This was their first offshore wind opportunity that they took, a £3 million contract for the NNG offshore wind farm. This is one of the examples where they weren't actually exporting directly themselves. So the contract they won with Saipem in the UK, but Saipem in the UK were using the cranes to ship it out to the Far East to help assist assembly and manufacture of the turbines out in the Far East. So they were effectively one step removed from the export, but because of that we were still able to support them because it was part of an export contract. In this case it was contract bonds, advance payment guarantees as well with them, so they had cash flow to supply and fulfill the contract. 80% is the maximum we can do, so the bank does have some skin in the game with everything we support. They have to have a 20% typically unsecured element to financing and to the facilities provide. We're restricted to a maximum of 80%, but most of the banks are on board with that, and they will provide the facility without a guarantee. And this is just another example, haven't really touched on it yet, but another example of how we provide support and how we actually help to generate export opportunities, more relevant to the OEMs, the developers in this case. So we supported 3 offshore wind farms in Taiwan last year, Formosa 2 being one of them. So £230 million facility this time, so it's significant. And what we do here is we are part of the facilities for the development, part of the investment process, if you like, typically the last brick in the wall in terms of funding the development to get to FID. In this case, 230 million. By doing this, what we do is we insist on a minimum of 20% UK content into the project. So typically it's substantially more than that. I think for this one it was more closer to 40%, because it has to be a minimum of 20%, so they can't scrape under the 19.5. So they tend to exceed the 20. And in this case, it was led by Macquarie's Green Investment Group and Swancore Renewable Energy, but there was a further 18 UK businesses, to our knowledge, maybe many more further down the supply chain engaged, but to our knowledge, there was at least 18 UK businesses that took advantage and were engaged with this project, largely due to our support and the need for that 20% UK content. And we do a number of these a year, not a huge number, a handful perhaps a year, but it's worth keeping an eye out for when we do these to make sure you're aware and you can plug into these opportunities as well. I think that was just a quick run through. As I said, not a lot, too much detail because of time. I would just make a couple of points at the end, just kind of key messages. So in terms of accessing our support, particularly the supply chain in the UK, really it's conversation with your bank or insurance company if you're looking to insure against your debtors, overseas debtors, and the private sector can't cover that. But talk to your bank manager, present your financials, present your case and your requirement, make sure they enlist the support of the international trade specialists. They say they're the ones that can really work with us to support and know how the system works, and they can access our support. If there's insufficient security, absolutely make sure the trade specialist is involved. The local bank managers are aware of us, but they're not dealing with us on a daily basis, so it may not be the first thing to think of. In terms of opportunities, the Formosa 2 was an example, really worth connecting with UK Export Finance through, as well as SDI and the DIT and SOEC and Deep Wind, etc., for opportunities. But you can connect with us through LinkedIn and Twitter. Any of these major projects that we're supporting will be notified on there. There's opportunities to register as a potential supplier for them. We run supplier fairs for those opportunities as well, so you can get engaged and have one-to-one conversations and learn more about the project and pitch your business to the developers. And obviously a full range of products and services available through the website and through LinkedIn and Twitter as well. So I will stop there. Happy to take questions at the end, and I will pass it over to David.
Thanks, Alistair, and thanks to the previous speakers as well. I'm just going to spend, and I only have 10 minutes, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about SDI, or Scottish Development International, and what it is that we do. I've made the cardinal error of having more slides than minutes, so I'll do my best to chunk through this. Some of you will know quite a lot about SDI, hopefully, and some of you will not know so much. So we are the Trade and Investment Agency. We're part of the Scottish Government. So we cover all of Scotland, including the High and the South of Scotland area. So we see ourselves all Scotland agency. And we, as it says there, single point of contact for all our international trade and investment needs. And of course we work with, we've mentioned these already today, DIT, local authorities and others as well. So there you are, you can see it for yourself. We have a mixture of staff based in Scotland and of course a lot of staff based overseas. This is very up to date because we have someone starting in Perth, for example, this very week. So we've got over 100 staff based overseas, number of offices, countries, etc. And here is my team. The names are a little bit small there, but you'll see that as part of my team, we're split into 5 geographies. So Fiona Topping, who's based in Scotland, Nico, who's based in Toronto, Kevin, based in Taiwan, David in Paris, and Andy based in Ghana. So each of these team leaders have a number of individuals. Many of these names, if you can do them, I'm sure you'll know. And the job of my team is, in essence, is to help Scottish companies trade overseas. So their job is primarily to sort of work with Scottish companies, understand Scottish capability, and then working with my overseas colleagues, find those opportunities. So, the projects, the companies, the opportunities that Alistair and Alan were referring to previously, how do we get the Scottish capability there, known and in front of the right decision makers? Within SDI, we're split largely into a trade side of the organisation and inward investment side of the organisation, and I'm the head of the trade side for energy. So how can we help companies? These are very high level, and again, some of you will know this, but on the trade side, which I'll focus on, I've mentioned it already, market opportunities, market intelligence, strategy development, etc., etc. And we've given some quotes there from a number of companies who, thankfully, we've been able to help. The rest of my very short time with you today, I'm just going to go through a couple of practical and examples of the type of things as SDI we can do to help companies. So I've mentioned some of these already. So our focus, of course, is on export support. And these are just the various sort of bullet points that I'm going to go through in detail in a second. So we have an international helpline, the details there. These slides will be made available after, so don't worry about scribbling down phone numbers and email addresses and so on. As you can imagine, particularly in certain sectors, energy as well, but particular sectors like food and drink, our international helpline has been quite active in the last 6 to 9 months or so in relation to Brexit. But it is there to give you a whole range of answers, or if we can't answer, we can signpost you to people who can. So that, if you haven't had much dealings with us previously, that would be a very good place to start, and you can contact us via our website, email, and telephone number as well. So as part of this, and this is a service for whether you're an existing exporter or a new start on the export journey, up to our market research team can give you a certain number of days resource to help that international market research. So we can give you research on, as it says there, competitor insights, global intelligence, industry trends, forecasts. We subscribe to a number of databases, for example. So again, behind all this slide, there's a lot of additional information. And again, there's the contact details for companies that allow you to do that. Again, it's about identifying the market. How do we validate that opportunity? Some assessment of key competitors, etc., etc. So there's quite a range of things we can do, and obviously particularly for smaller companies, or indeed for early exporters or new to a particular market, this is the kind of valuable advice that we can give. We can also provide, as well as that sort of international market research, my colleagues on the previous slide, my team, I guess, we can also provide, our own individual experience and contacts as well if needed. But this is a very good place to start to get that initial conversation. One of the things we've been doing, as you can imagine, we've been doing a lot in the last year and a half in relation to the recovery and pandemic, etc. So we've done this for a range of sectors, but for energy, we've published a number of what we call market reports. So you'll see there, hydrogen in Germany, India DCOM, etc., etc. So we've got a number of offshore wind reports as well. They are available on our website. If you struggle to find them, just drop us a line and we'll get them to you. There are more behind these, and we're planning to publish more, hopefully later this year. But these give you a sort of snapshot, if you like, of some particular opportunities in particular geographies. Many of you will know, there may be one or two on the call today, our Global Scot network. So our Global Scots are sort of an alumni of either Scots born, Scots studied, Scots connection. You don't have to be Scottish to be a Global Scot, but you have to have, a sort of a love for Scotland, I guess, or an empathy for Scotland. You've reached a certain level in your career, and you want to give something back. So it's really about giving one-to-one support to companies, again, whether it be a query, how to do business, is it possible you could open a door to me, etc., contacts, etc. as well. We have a new Global Scot website, the address is there, and that website also contains information on our Global Scots. But you can also, if you have a particular query, you can in effect put that on the system, and you can be connected up, or Global Scots can volunteer to have a conversation with you. This is something that's fairly new, and we're just starting this out. We've been a little bit delayed on this, but something we're calling Export Champions, sort of business mentoring scheme, as it says there, that in effect, you learn from people who've done it already, or companies who have already done it already, not necessarily competitors, of course, because we understand that wouldn't be appropriate, but for companies who've already exported, perhaps with knowledge of a particular market or a country in terms of particular issues around exporting to that market, we can put you in touch with someone who's done that before. And again, there's more information on this slide about where you can get more information on that as well. That's fairly new, but it's something we're really keen to do. And of course, like everybody else, we've done our fair share of market events and webinars in the last 12 to 18 months. We're no different from anybody else. We have a forward look of our webinars on our website. And of course, we're planning, and some of this may be virtual, but we're really hopeful that sometime this year and certainly into 22, that we're going to have some element of physical missions and events. So again, you can find out more information on that as well. This is just a snapshot. This is obviously very variable and subject to change, as they say. We have a whole list of events. Scottish Enterprise or SDI, we don't necessarily lead in all these, but we're certainly involved in these, whether it be as a partner or as just making companies aware of them, speaking or whatever. Again, if there's an event in that list that you're particularly interested in, please drop us a line and we can do our best to facilitate and help that as well. I'm almost out of time and we're almost there. Again, I mentioned partners at the start. The Scottish Chambers of Commerce Network with support from Scottish Government have a number of trade mission opportunities. These are what we call in our language cross-sector opportunities. Again, you can find more information at that Export Hub Scotland website on those as well. Energy will be components of some of that as well. And I think I finished on time. Again, these are all the contact details. Don't worry, as I say, if you don't get a chance to write these down, you'll get these slides. A good place to start, if you haven't heard much about us or you don't know much about us, is our top line there, .com International. You'll find out a lot there. I'm really sorry, this is a huge, run through in a very short space of time, but I'm really hopeful that it gives you a snapshot or a flavour of who we are and what it is that we do. And obviously, energy is important for us. I'm going to finish there. Thanks for your time. Thanks for the chance to speak today. And I'm going to hand over to Paul O'Brien, who's going to facilitate the Q&A.
Thanks, David. Okay, so we move into the Q&A session. We've got a number of questions that we're going to try and cover off. If I can just ask all the speakers to put their video on again so we can see all your exciting or excited faces. Right, here we go. The first up, now this is a sort of somebody agreeing with Alan. So there's a good start, Alan.
That's not a good start.
So Hugh is just saying this is going back to Alan's presentation. Echo Alan's point about prospect of supply chain decisions being taken well in advance of development of the formal go-ahead, favouring incumbent manufacturers and suppliers at the expense of new entrants. And he's saying that perseverance, resilience required to develop relationships and disrupt existing hookups or preferences. They ask us any general advice, guidance on this piece. So the question about when is the right time to be in the market, you can be really early and possibly too early, or you can wait too long and end up getting locked out the supply chain. Well, Alan, since it's about your presentation, let's go to you first. What's your thoughts on that? What's the timing?
So I think probably what I've done there has been a bit guilty of making it too simple with a graph. But I guess that's my advice, is that variations on a theme, that's how projects, how long they take to go, that they do follow a flow. So I think the advice I'd give, it very much depends, and as Hugh's picked up on, it depends who your customer is, because as I say, if you're pitching into one of these tier 1 contractors or whatever, at the point of a CFD getting awarded or an FID being taken, you're probably too late. So the timing question is really about what, how, is it an EPCI contract? Is it a multi-contract? How is that market going? So I guess that would be my advice, is try and work with that standard that I have. Those are generally the cycles, and it's just really trying to make sure that as Paul said, you can be too early and too late, and sometimes I guess it's probably better being a bit too early. But yeah, there is no easy answer to it. As I say, I just think it's showing an appreciation. How the project will unfold, what its pinch points are, what its challenges are, and really just sort of making an appropriate approach from that.
All right, okay, so it's Goldilocks and the three bears, and the porridge is either cold or roasting hot, so you want something in the middle. David, can I come to you, because this is very much in SDI's gift as well, given that you're trying to encourage the companies into the market. How do you decide when the time is right for, particularly on the supply chain side?
Good question. Thanks, Paul. So I think it's about our team and my team knowing the company and knowing kind of where the market is, and knowing, working with, my colleagues based overseas to say, well, this project is, these are the pipeline of projects. This is what they're looking for in terms of gaps or capabilities. And then, hopefully, us working with the companies that we support to say, okay, this sounds interesting. I think this is a good time for you. Or, can you fill this gap? If you can't fill this gap, how can we help you fill it? Whether it's now or 6 months or whatever. So it's really, I suppose it's about understanding that, the gaps, there will be gaps. Some companies will be there, could do it today. Some will be able to do it further down the line. So it's understanding where the company's at and a kind of honest conversation with the company. And it's that balance of, making them excited about the opportunity, but also being realistic and saying, okay, how can we help you make the best of that opportunity? So it's really about just talking to the company, understanding where they're at, having a plan, and saying, here's where we are in the next 6 months, or 9 months, a year, whatever. Here's where we want to increase our capability. Are there areas where you can go win a contract right now? And if so, let's get on with it. If there are areas where you can't, or for whatever reason, or you need a little bit of help, here's what we can do. And my colleagues, particularly based overseas, their role is primarily is to hunt, and if I can use that analogy, and to find the opportunities. And then colleagues in Scotland are really to sort of bring the Scottish companies to the table, as it were, ready to be successful. So it's, as you know, Paul, and indeed many others, it's an ongoing process. It never ends. It's like the Forth Rail Bridge. We're constantly at it. But I think it's really about understanding where the company is, understanding the market. And I think some of the stuff that Alan put up there today I certainly learned a lot. And understanding where they are. But it's easy to look at the headline figures. It's easy to, oh wow, there's a big market. It's when it's getting below that, I think that's really important. And my team, as you can imagine, my team's changing as the world is changing. My team's changing, right? So we're having to know more than we did 2 years ago, 5 years ago about offshore wind. So, but we're doing it. So sorry, long answer to a short question. I think it's just about understanding where the company is, being realistic but also ambitious at the same time, and saying and understanding where are the projects, where are the opportunities, and how can we best get company X, where can they go, where are they best placed to go? Because as Alan highlighted, there's lots of opportunity. So it's trying to understand that in a little bit more granular fashion.
Okay.
I think if I could add, sorry, Paul, jumping in there, but essentially, what I've done with this piece of work and whatever, and it's a very Scottish approach, is just to get out there and look for an angle, and you don't obviously, to David's point, you don't get that from the headline acts and X about the billions and whatever. It's about getting into, which hopefully you'll see when you get the slides, but it's about looking for an angle. Is that developer active in Scotland? Are they, because. And it's really just about looking for that angle. Is there an oil and gas angle? It's really, and that's the only advice I can give, is to get into the weeds of projects, get into the weeds of countries, because invariably all of those slides I've done there, I've found an angle somewhere. And that essentially is what offshore wind internationally is about. Because unfortunately, I know a lot of you out there. I know all the war stories. I know how tough you find it out there, sometimes even in the UK. So there is a bit of a thought of if I can't win in the UK, how am I going to do it internationally? But this is the reality, I'm afraid, that in the UK we do have sort of local content that you're not going to have that kind of buffer out there. If anything, you're going to be on the opposite side of the fence doing that. So again, internationally, it's about finding an angle, and as Hugh said, being diligent and not giving up and just being at it. But there are angles out there, trust me.
Well, funnily enough, that sort of leads us into another question that is really about Scotland has a lot of experience in subsea, particularly from oil and gas, and also now into renewables to switch over. I mean, is this something that we should use as a hook in markets where basically there isn't any subsea industry at all. So is this something that we should really be motoring on? A question to the panel. Who's want to put their hand up?
I'll give you an initial. So interestingly on that, I actually have Liz Burdock from the US reached out to me last week, and I have a call on that very subject lined up for Friday. Is on that topic about how do in the US we leverage the oil and gas experience we've got, get that over to. So again, you're absolutely right, and a great question out there is that is absolutely an angle that I'm talking about. Is this oil and gas type experience? You know, some countries just don't have that. You know, countries like Ireland, countries like Japan. So, you know, there are some big gaps that these countries absolutely recognise and need importers. Do you know what I mean? So, yeah, it's absolutely just looking for that angle. Yeah, the oil and gas angle is one very quick point I'll make on that is not to overplay that sometimes. I think it was one of your colleagues, David, that actually pointed out to me that, you know, if you're targeting the US, for example, maybe don't go too much on oil and gas, because you're dealing with sort of northeast liberal states, and the oil and gas sector is very much Houston. So again, it's absolutely in terms of proving our capability, oil and gas, but mention it carefully. I guess black is a dirty word, is it? Still somewhere, but yeah. It is a capability thing. A great question, though.
Yeah, if I can briefly, yeah, just very quickly. So I think good advice there at the end as well, Alan. But you know, overall, I think it's a good thing that we've got an oil and gas history than that we don't in this particular area. But I take your point. You know, it's better to have it than not. And then the second brief point is that Subsea UK, you know, the trade body for the subsea industry, which incidentally we helped set up many moons ago, is changing. So you may have heard of this proposed project, the Global Underwater Hub, which will be a hub and spoke model in Aberdeen, and we don't have time to go into it today. But in essence, what it's trying to do is, how do you take the Scottish subsea capability, which has started in oil and gas, and move it into a whole range of sectors? You know, offshore wind, defence, marine, etc., etc. So there's going to be government money, and as I say, we don't have time today to go into it. That is in effect going to set that hub up. So it's a reality. It's an example of an industry and a government saying, okay, we recognise the opportunity here. The subsea needs to change. How can we do that? We need a bit of government money to help us do that. So I think, to go back to the question, you know, yes is the short answer. And the subsea industry again is going to change in the way that many other industries are changing as well.
One thing just to add, sorry, Paul, I know we need me to move on, but it was in the press today. Go and have a look what BP have just said. They couldn't have written a better response to that question. They essentially just talk about the importance of the Scottish oil and gas sector and how it transfers. So, you know, it's in the press today. Go and have a look at what BP have said today. That they've literally just basically reinforced how important oil and gas is going to be. And again, BP, you know, you've got to remember, round 4, they cleaned up down south very recently, so a very, very serious developer. So, you know, there's an absolute recognition out there, particularly from the oil and gas majors, that oil and gas has a huge role to play coming over to offshore wind.
Okay, I'm conscious of the time. We've got time for maybe one last question, which was one that came in right at the start before we even kicked off, 3 minutes before we started. It's a bit tongue-in-cheek, I would think. Are you pleased with the way ScotWind is being handled? Stephen, you want to come back on that?
Well, I think that we've got clarity now. Clearly, what happened in round 4 down south made the Scottish Government and Crown Estate Scotland sit up and think a bit. Were they missing an opportunity to perhaps land a little bit more value for seabed licenses? And I think that the short delay was justified, and I think the outcome of their analysis was also justified, because I think that for supply chain growth in Scotland, we've identified that we do need assistance. We need support, because financial institutions and banks, you know, they want a pound for their buck, and they're not going to give debt very easily. They have a lot of conditions, and some of those conditions are around commitment. And I think that what ScotWind does is it gives that level of commitment to the financial community in the future. to give confidence to invest more in our supply chain and help to grow it. So in my view, the short delay that we had, I hope will become immaterial. I hope that we will catch up very quickly, and we will give confidence to the money lenders to have confidence in our supply chain and invest in it, because on our doorstep is a wealth of opportunity.
Good answer. Okay, now we are out of time, I'm afraid, so it just remains for me to thank Jaya and Gillian for kicking this off, and for Jaya's usual control on the web system. To our speakers, Alistair, Alan, David and Stephen, for their great presentations, and hopefully, well, especially to you, the audience out there, this is not a one-off. Feel free to come back and ask further questions of myself or our speakers today, and we can pass them on. But again, thanks for your participation, and hope to see you at the next webinar. And it's a big thank you from Deepwind and Forth and Tay. Thanks for your participation. Bye for now.